What if your silence says more about your strength than all the words you've ever spoken? What if the most respected men aren't the ones who speak often, but the ones who know exactly when not to? What if the words you don't say are quietly building or quietly destroying your credibility every single day? Most men were taught that confidence comes from knowing what to say, from speaking with authority, from having something smart to contribute in every room they walk into. But the deeper truth, the one almost no one talks about, is that intelligent men don't lead with their words. They lead with their restraint, because they've learned that silence, when held with intention, speaks louder than any perfectly crafted sentence ever could. They know that every time you speak, you're either building your credibility or breaking it down, not just in how others see you, but in how much weight your words will carry when they matter most. I've seen this play out in boardrooms, in barbershops, in backyards and late-night walks, and again and again. The men who held the most influence weren't the loudest. They were the calmest, the ones who listened more than they spoke, the ones who didn't fill silence with noise, but treated it like a sacred space where wisdom might walk in. And here's the truth no one warns you about. Every word you speak is a small deposit into your reputation. But the wrong phrase, said at the wrong time, can withdraw far more than you think. That's why the wisest men avoid certain phrases, not because they're flawless, but because they've been burned by careless talk. They've felt what it costs to speak from ego instead of clarity. So in this series, we're going to uncover 7 phrases that intelligent, grounded men choose not to say. Not because they're afraid of being wrong, but because they understand that restraint isn't weakness. It's discipline, it's presence, it's leadership. And as you listen, I invite you to do more than just hear these ideas. Ask yourself, where in your life has speaking too quickly, too often, or too defensively cost you more than it gave you? And more importantly, what would shift if you chose to pause, to listen, to master the moment before the words even come? This isn't about silence for the sake of silence. This is about learning the quiet power of a man who doesn't need to say everything to be heard. Because in a noisy world, stillness stands out. And self-awareness? That's the language of strength. There's a phrase that sounds confident on the surface, but quietly shuts the door to growth every time it's spoken. I already know that. It slips out in conversations, hides in our body language, or worse, lives quietly in our mind as we nod, tune out, and dismiss what's being said because we think we've heard it all before. I've caught myself doing it. A few years back, I was sitting in a workshop, arms crossed. I was already checked out. I told myself nothing new here. But then, buried in a sentence I almost didn't hear, the speaker reframed everything I thought I understood, and I almost missed it because my ego had already left the room. That moment stuck with me, because here's the truth. When a man says, "I already know that," what he's often really saying is, "I'm done learning." And that's not confidence. That's pride in disguise. That's ego building a wall between who you are and who you could become. The wisest men I've ever met don't talk like they know everything. They ask. They lean in. They assume there's always more to discover, not just about the topic, but about themselves. Stoic wisdom reminds us, as long as you live, keep learning how to live. That's not just a nice quote, it's a way of being. Life's greatest lessons don't always arrive in brand new packaging. Sometimes, they're hidden in repetition, in nuance, in the exact thing you thought you understood, just told from a perspective you weren't ready for last time. So the next time you catch yourself tuning out or brushing something off because you've heard it before, stop, breathe, ask a better question, because maybe you're not supposed to learn the fact. Maybe you're here to learn the lens. There's a phrase that sounds practical, even wise, but it quietly builds a cage around your potential every time you say it. That won't work. I've heard it in meetings, in creative sessions, in relationships, and I've said it myself more times than I'd like to admit. It usually shows up when something new is on the table. A different strategy, a bold idea, a suggestion that requires discomfort or uncertainty. And the voice, sometimes yours, sometimes someone else's, cuts in and says, "That won't work." At first, it feels logical, responsible, grounded. But if you really listen beneath the surface, you'll often hear something else. Fear. Not fear of logic or failure, but fear of change. Fear of being seen trying. Fear of not being in control of the outcome. Years ago, I worked alongside a man named Thomas. He was smart, respected, well-read, but also deeply resistant to change. No matter what idea came up, new software, restructuring a workflow, even just shifting a meeting time, his default answer was always, "That won't work." And people listened, because on the surface, he sounded experienced, cautious. But with time, I realized Thomas wasn't evaluating the idea. He was defending his comfort zone. His certainty became a shield, and that phrase became a cage. He didn't realize that what he was really saying wasn't about the idea at all. It was about his unwillingness to face what he couldn't control, what he feared. The Stoics were clear about this kind of fear. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." And that quote lives in my head every time I hear myself dismiss a new possibility too quickly. Because truthfully, most of what we label as impossible isn't fact, it's prediction. It's our brain trying to protect us from the unknown by making it feel already decided. But the unknown isn't the enemy. It's the birthplace of every breakthrough. And you don't need to see the whole staircase to take the first step. The smartest men I've met don't wait for perfect clarity. They ask one question: what's the next move within my control? Then they make it. One step, one test, one attempt. They aren't reckless, they're deliberate. They face the fog with movement, not paralysis. And over time, those small steps open up a path that seemed blocked from a distance. I remember a project I almost said no to. The deadline was impossible, the budget was tight, the team was new. Every logical part of me said, "Don't touch it, it won't work." But I paused. I thought about Marcus Aurelius's words, "What is within your power right now?" And that question unlocked the moment. I stopped needing a guarantee. I just made the first call. Then I sent the first email. And one step at a time, that project became the most transformative thing I'd ever led. Not because we had some brilliant plan, but because we refused to let fear wear the mask of reason. So the next time your instinct says, "That won't work," pause. Ask yourself, is that logic or fear? Is this truly impossible or just uncomfortable? Because the line between the two is thinner than you think. And men who grow, men who lead, men who leave an impact, They don't avoid that line, they walk it. Not with blind optimism, but with quiet courage. Because Stoic courage isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward anyway, even when you're unsure, especially when you're unsure. And when you start doing that, step by step, you realize something powerful. Most paths weren't blocked. You just hadn't walked far enough to see the way through. There's a sentence that slips out of almost every man's mouth at some point. Sometimes loud, sometimes under our breath, sometimes only in our head. That's not my fault. And it sounds harmless, reasonable even. After all, you didn't cause the delay, you didn't start the argument, you didn't crash the market. You were just doing your part. But here's the hard truth most men don't realize. Every time we push away responsibility, even when we're technically right, we also give away our power. Because the moment you say, "It wasn't me," what you're really saying is, "There's nothing I can do." And that, right there, is the beginning of helplessness. I remember working on a team years ago where a big project fell apart. Deadlines missed, fingers pointing in every direction. One guy in particular had a detailed list of everything that went wrong, none of which involved him. The client changed scope. The team was disorganized. The tools we had were outdated. And to be fair, all of those were true. But while he was busy being technically right, he completely missed the opportunity to grow. He was so focused on defending his image that he didn't see the one thing that could have changed his future: ownership. Because the moment you say, "I played a part in that," everything shifts. You get your influence back. You're no longer a bystander in your own results. You're the one behind the wheel. Stoic philosophy teaches this clearly. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you respond that matters." And that response always starts with ownership. Because ownership isn't about blame, it's about control. It's about looking at what happened and asking the question most men avoid: what could I have done better? Even if it was just 10%, even if it was only your tone, your timing, your preparation. That's where your strength lives. That's where growth begins. I've lived it. There were times I wanted to defend myself, wanted to prove I was right. But when I looked closer, when I stopped pointing and started reflecting, I found gaps I had overlooked, assumptions I hadn't questioned, details I had skipped. And when I chose to take responsibility, not because it was demanded, but because it was powerful, everything got lighter. The frustration lifted, the blame faded, and in its place was clarity, direction, self-respect. Because responsibility is heavy, yes, but it builds muscle of character, of leadership, of peace. Blame is cheap. It spreads fast. It feels good in the moment, but it keeps you stuck in a cycle of waiting for apologies, for understanding, for someone else to fix the problem. Intelligent men don't wait to be rescued. They lead themselves out, and they do it by asking a better question. What can I own here? Because that question doesn't just change the current situation. It changes who you become the next time things go sideways. So the next time you catch yourself thinking, "That wasn't my fault," pause, step back, ask yourself, is this about being right or becoming better? One builds walls, the other builds strength. Choose the one that moves you forward. There's a quiet belief that lives in the background of many men's minds. It doesn't shout, it doesn't make a scene, but it's always there, whispering in moments of pressure, in times of overwhelm, in the weight of solitude. I've got this. I don't need help. And for a while, that belief might feel like strength, like independence, like honor. We admire the lone wolf, the silent warrior, the man who doesn't complain and never asks. We grow up thinking that real men carry it all, silently, no matter how heavy. But here's the truth. Most of us learn the hard way. That belief, that voice, that mindset doesn't make you strong. It makes you slowly disappear inside yourself. It makes you isolated, exhausted, and eventually invisible. I remember sitting across from a man in his 50s, respected, successful, disciplined, a business owner, a father. On paper, he had it all together, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that his smile couldn't cover. And over coffee, he said something I'll never forget. For 20 years, I thought strength meant never letting anyone carry even 1 ounce of my load. I thought if I ever leaned on someone, it made me weak. But it didn't make me stronger. It just made me alone. That moment changed me, because like him, I'd bought the same lie. That asking for help was failure. That silence was strength. But the Stoics never preached isolation. They believed in self-mastery, yes, but they also believed in community, in brotherhood, in interdependence. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor, a philosopher, one of history's most powerful men, wrote openly about the people who shaped him, who challenged him, who guided him. He didn't pretend to be self-made. He didn't hide behind pride. He honored the men who helped him grow. Because asking for help isn't giving up power, it's expanding it. It's recognizing that resilience isn't built alone, and that the strongest men aren't the ones who never ask, but the ones who know when to. Because support isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I've had moments too. Nights when the pressure got so loud, I couldn't hear anything else. Times when I thought, just push through, don't bother anyone. And every time I stayed quiet, the weight only grew. Until finally, I called someone, a mentor, a friend. I didn't need them to fix it. I just needed someone to know. And in that moment, I didn't feel weak. I felt seen, human, alive again. We all need that. And we all need to be reminded, you don't have to do it alone. You were never supposed to. So if you've ever caught yourself saying, I don't need help, pause for a second. Ask yourself, is that strength speaking, or is that fear pretending to be pride? Because true strength isn't how long you can carry everything by yourself. It's how willing you are to say, I'm carrying too much, and let someone in. That's not weakness, that's courage. And in a world that tells men to bottle everything up, choosing connection is one of the bravest things you can do. There's a phrase that sounds reasonable, quiet, even wise, a phrase we whisper to ourselves, not with drama, but with resignation. I'm too old for that. And it doesn't always show up as defeat. Sometimes it's packaged as maturity. That dreams for younger men. That ship has sailed. That part of me, it belonged to another time. But underneath those words, behind the calm tone and the rational justifications, is something much heavier. It's not wisdom, it's surrender. And it quietly kills more dreams than failure ever could. I've seen it happen too many times. A man full of potential, creativity, and perspective shuts the door, not because he can't, but because he no longer believes time belongs to him. But let me offer you a different lens. I once met a man named David. 67 years old, retired, gray hair, steady voice, eyes that had clearly seen a lot. One day, he enrolled in a photography course, not because he wanted a new career, but because he had always been curious. He wanted to see the world through a different lens, literally. At first, he told me, he felt out of place. Everyone around him was in their 20s. The instructor was younger than his daughter, and the voice showed up. "What am I doing here?" But he stayed. He kept showing up. And by the end of the course, his final project, a black and white photo series of elderly hands, was the most talked about in the entire class. Not because it was technically perfect, but because it carried depth, perspective, heart. David's story is a reminder that "I'm too old" is rarely a truth. It's a fear disguised as logic. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius didn't fear death because he knew time wasn't measured in years. It was measured in meaning. He didn't ask, "How much time do I have?" He asked, "What will I do with what remains?" That question changes everything. I've seen men in their 60s start new businesses, write books, mentor boys who never had fathers, and I've seen men in their 30s quit on themselves. The difference? It was never age. It was mindset. Because your body may slow, but your capacity for impact, for growth, for presence, that doesn't expire. Stoic wisdom isn't about chasing everything. It's about choosing. And as long as you are, there's still something left to give, to learn, to live. You're not too old. You're too valuable to waste what's still in your hands. There's a phrase that feels harmless, almost responsible, like a man who has a plan. "I'll do it later." It rolls off the tongue so easily that we barely notice it. We say it when we're tired, distracted, uncertain, or simply don't want to face what matters most. But over time, that phrase becomes something much heavier. It becomes a quiet grave where important things are buried alive. A conversation we never have, a letter we never send, a dream we never start. We convince ourselves it's not the right time, that we'll get to it tomorrow, after the pressure dies down, after work slows, after life gets less messy. But here's the truth. The things we say we'll do later often become the things we never do at all. Not because we're lazy, but because delay has a cost. And that cost is peace. I knew a man named Eric. Steady guy, solid career, 2 sons, a wife who adored him. From the outside, everything looked good, but he carried a growing list of things he hadn't done. Things he wanted to say, experiences he wanted to create. He always said, "I'll write that letter next week. I'll take the boys camping when things settle. I'll fix things with my brother after the holidays." And then, one day, he got the call. His brother had passed. No warning, no final talk, just silence. A relationship frozen in time, unfinished, and a message he had meant to send still sitting in his drafts. Eric told me this not looking for pity, but as a warning. A reminder that time doesn't wait for your perfect moment. It moves without your permission. The Stoics understood this better than anyone. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do, say, and think." That wasn't meant to scare. It was meant to wake us up. Because delay doesn't just steal opportunity, it steals presence. Every time you put off something important, you carry it like a stone in your pocket. It weighs on your thoughts, your posture, your peace. Even when you forget it's there, it shapes the way you show up in the world. I've done it too. There were phone calls I meant to make, words I meant to say, promises I meant to keep. And each delay added up, not into disaster, but into dullness, the quiet ache of unfinished intentions. Until one day I stopped waiting. I picked up the phone. I said what I needed to say. Not to fix everything, but to stop pretending I had forever. And that moment, it was light. It was clean. It reminded me that action doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. The Stoics didn't teach us to move fast. They taught us to move now, on what matters. So the next time you catch yourself saying, "I'll do it later," pause. Ask yourself, what's the cost of delay? What's the weight of one more undone thing? Then take the step, write the sentence, make the call. Not because you're rushed, but because you finally see clearly. Later is where regret lives, but now is where life happens. There's a phrase that sounds like self-awareness, but underneath, it's really quiet surrender. That's just how I am. It's the kind of thing we say in moments of frustration or discomfort. When someone calls out our pattern, when life asks us to adapt, when growth feels inconvenient, we shrug and say, "This is who I've always been." And at first, it feels honest, maybe even admirable, like we're owning our identity. But if we look closer, that phrase isn't about ownership, it's about avoidance. Because what we're often really saying is, "This is who I've chosen to stay." I once worked with a man named Neil, smart, driven, respected, but also known for one thing, his temper. He would interrupt people in meetings and always take offense at the slightest disagreement. When someone finally had the courage to ask why he reacted like that, he gave the classic answer, "That's who I've always been," as if that made it permanent, untouchable, unchangeable. But here's the truth. Who we've always been is just a story we've told ourselves enough times that it started feeling like truth. The Stoics never believed character was fixed. They believed it was formed through repetition, through choice, through discomfort. Epictetus said, "It's not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them." In the same way, it's not your nature that limits you. It's the story you protect about that nature. Growth isn't denial, it's revision. I've had my own versions of that sentence. When I used to shut down emotionally, I'd say, "I just don't open up easily." When I avoided conflict, I'd say, "I'm just a laid-back guy." But none of those were facts. They were defense mechanisms dressed as personality traits. What was really happening? I didn't want to face what changing would require. Vulnerability, humility, effort. And those things are uncomfortable, but they're also the gateway to becoming better. The most grounded, powerful men I know aren't the ones who say, "This is just how I am." They're the ones who ask, "Is this still who I want to be?" Because that question leads to freedom. It opens the door to an identity that's evolving, not anchored in survival mode. Stoic wisdom teaches that identity isn't static. It's sculpted, day by day, in the choices we make when no one's watching. You don't become wise by declaring who you are. You become wise. So let today be the day you stop defending your limits and start walking toward the man you're capable of becoming. That's not weakness. That's power in motion. The truth is, no man is perfect, but the wisest men I've ever known share something far more valuable than perfection. They're relentlessly honest with themselves. Not in a loud, dramatic way. In a quiet, daily discipline. They observe their thoughts. They question their patterns. They don't fear being wrong. And they don't pretend to have all the answers. What they fear is standing still. They fear becoming frozen in the illusion that they've already arrived, that there's nothing left to sharpen, nothing left to challenge. And that mindset of always being open, always learning, always refining, is what sets them apart. These men don't avoid the slow erosion of growth. Every phrase they avoid is a small rebellion against the voice of comfort. I already know that. That won't work. That's just how I am. These are not just statements, they're decisions. Decisions to stop growing. And wise men don't make that trade. Instead of making excuses, they take action. Instead of defending their ego, they lean in and listen. Instead of waiting for the right time, they begin now, imperfectly, but intentionally. That's the through line. That's the thread. Not a polished image, but a persistent hunger to grow. So if something in this series stirred something in you, don't wait for the next crisis to start becoming who you were meant to be. Choose a new phrase, choose a better question, and above all, choose to move forward, not later, not when it's convenient, now. Because the men who change the world don't speak the loudest, they live the most awake.